Today we're going to focus on films and series for immersing in Brazilian Portuguese, and at the end, we'll look at how to fit this immersion into a method and routine that will help you on your way to learning the language. This video is part of a series of videos looking at resources you can use to immerse in Brazilian Portuguese. These are divided into various topics so that you can find resources for areas that interest you. The links will be in the description below. For many people, films and series are one of the most enjoyable ways of immersing in a language. In this video, we'll look at a few channels and suggest a handful of Brazilian films towards the end. Though we'll only cover a few channels in the video itself, more will be listed in the description below. There aren't many channels that focus solely on Brazilian films, so it's worth bearing in mind that you won't always see content from them relating to Brazil. Many of them discuss films and series from around the world, and each varies in how much coverage it gives to Brazilian cinema. Fortunately, there are some channels that focus predominantly on Brazilian films and series, but even channels that don't can still be useful. For example, if you've just watched a decent series from a different country, you may still enjoy hearing these channels discuss that series, and you'd still be immersing in Brazilian Portuguese in the process. The first channel we'll look at is Cinegito. It focuses on Brazilian cinema more than the majority of the channels mentioned in this video and in the description below. There's several excellent videos about the history of Brazilian cinema, covering various topics, from different forms of cinema to the effects of neoliberalism on the Brazilian film industry. This one here discusses what's known as a retomada do cinema brasileiro. The term a retomada could be translated in various ways, each amounting to fairly similar things in English. I guess it would literally mean the retaking, but in English, and particularly for this context, we'd probably call it something like the resurgence of Brazilian cinema, the revival of Brazilian cinema, or even the resumption of Brazilian cinema. As is often the case with translation, there's more than one possible answer, and you may as well make your own mind up after hearing a bit more of the context. For this, I'd recommend watching Cinegito's video about a retomada, but I'll give a quick summary of the wider context here. In the 1980s, Brazilian cinema, while still producing some great films, was struggling in the face of external issues. Economic depression and rises in the price of film screenings led to a drop in cinema attendance, and the rising popularity both of Brazilian telenovelas, available on people's TVs at home, and the prominence of Hollywood films, left the Brazilian film industry fighting for a shrinking portion of people's attention. This was compounded in the early 90s under the government of Fernando Collor de Mello, who was the first democratically elected president of Brazil since the military dictatorship had ended in 1985. Collor's rule only lasted from 1990 to 1992, but it was significant for the country. As was happening throughout the parts of the world dominated by the United States and its lapdog, Great Britain, neoliberalism was expanded in Brazil. Without wanting to go into too much detail, neoliberalism could be simplified as the tail wagging the dog. Where states, and thus in theory their people, should be holding sway over corporations, the opposite happens. Political decisions are made for the sake of increasing profits and eroding the public sphere for the gain of private interests. It's something much of the world is still in the throes of today, and unfortunately it's something that's only got worse since the late 80s and early 90s, when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher began exporting this cancer across the world. As part of his neoliberal policies, Fernando Collor de Mello cut funding to the Brazilian film industry and dismantled a number of federal bodies whose role it had been to promote and encourage Brazilian cinema, such as the Fundação do Cinema Brasileiro. Though documentaries and short films were able to survive in these conditions, the production of major films became almost impossible. With the end of Collor's reign in 1992 and the election of Fernando Henrique Cardoso in 1995, the Brazilian film industry returned with renewed vigour, typified by a series of films in the mid-90s with historical settings and satirical styles. By the late 90s and early 2000s, films like Central do Brasil and Cidade de Deus were being recognised internationally. Before looking at other specific channels, it's worth mentioning several useful videos from various channels. On the channel Canal Brasil, there's a series of videos presented by Luli, from the channel Luli de Verdade. Luli presents videos on an array of interesting topics relating to the Brazilian film industry, from the beginnings of cinema in Brazil to a retomada and even a general history of Brazilian cinema. On her own channel, she covers films and series from around the world and not just Brazil, so it's also a channel you could watch if you've just watched a non-Brazilian series or film, but would still like to immerse in Brazilian Portuguese and hear what someone else thought of it. Either way, she does have videos covering Brazilian cinema as well. A similar channel is Elegante, who covers films and series from around the world but has some great videos discussing the themes in certain Brazilian films, such as Central do Brasil. Canal Brasil also have videos encompassing wider aspects and figures of Brazilian culture. For example, there's this video about the actor, screenwriter and director Glauber Rocha, as well as this one about the author Jorge Amado. Finally, Meteoro Brasil have produced this interesting video about the past and present of Brazilian cinema. The next two channels we'll look at are Entre Planos and Avmakers. Entre Planos covers a wide range of topics relating to films and even has a playlist dedicated to Brazilian cinema. Avmakers focuses more on filmmaking, such as equipment, techniques, resources, that sort of thing, but they also have videos about different periods and movements within Brazilian cinema. Another channel worth mentioning is Carol Moreira. Her videos cover all sorts of topics, as well as series and films from all over the world. She also has a playlist about the history of cinema. Finally, there's Casa do Cinema Brasileiro. As their name suggests, this channel focuses on Brazilian cinema, and there'd be a useful way to hear about the latest films and releases from Brazil. There'll be more channels listed in the description below, but we'll now quickly mention a handful of Brazilian films if you're looking for somewhere to start. There's obviously so much more to Brazilian cinema than the films I'm about to mention, but they're just suggestions for anyone who's looking for somewhere to begin. So, in no particular order, I'd recommend watching Bacurau, Central do Brasil, Cidade de Deus, Que Horas Ela Volta, Paraíso Perdido, and Quilombo, which is about the Quilombo dos Palmares. We'll discuss Quilombos in more detail in another video on Brazilian history and relevant resources and books in Portuguese, but for now it's important to know that they're a fundamental part of the history of Brazil and of resistance to the slave trade. As for the film itself, some people apparently aren't so keen on the fact it uses a soundtrack not from the period in which the film is set, which is 17th century Brazil. Personally, I really like it, and whatever your stance on the style of music in films, it's a great film about a very important part of Brazil's history, but also world history. The soundtrack is by Gilberto Gil, who you may well have heard of, and if you haven't, I definitely recommend listening to his music. You can find posts about these films on the How to Learn Languages website on the Portuguese resources page. The link will be in the description below, and we'll look at it in a bit more detail towards the end of the video. It's something that gets added to regularly, so you'll always have some suggestions for films to watch. I hope you found this video useful. We'll now look at how to fit immersion into a wider plan for learning Brazilian Portuguese. In terms of fitting the resources we've covered today into a plan for learning Brazilian Portuguese, there are 3 essential things you need to learn any language. These 3 things could be called different names based on personal preference, but they boil down to the same things. Now, these are the passive part of the process, the active part, and practice. The passive part of the process is perhaps most important in the sense that it's most likely to have been the missing ingredient, as when we learn languages at school, it's impossible to spend much time listening to the language in its normal form, at normal speed, and how it's used in daily life. And this is why, even though we perhaps learn how to conjugate some verbs and say a few sentences, when we actually hear the language properly in normal settings, we struggle to understand it. The active part is probably going to be the most familiar, in the sense that it does involve active study, but it doesn't have to be in the more traditional ways you may be used to from school. By all means, study grammar in isolation and verb tables if you enjoy that, as enjoyment is the most important thing, but you don't have to. The active part of the process for many people can just be a case of looking for new phrases and learning them, remembering them. Practice is just about having conversations, whether they're typed or spoken, with native speakers of that language, or people who speak that language to the level of a first language. Ideally, anyway. Now, if at the start you're a bit tentative and want to develop your Brazilian Portuguese a bit more before having conversations, that's absolutely fine. You can just pose questions to yourself and think of how you'd respond and practice answering them. It may sound a bit odd at first, but it's absolutely fine, and it is an effective way to improve. The most effective way for improving your fluency is to practice with other people, as it's the most immediate form and it will make your responses feel more automatic in future. But for many people it can seem a bit daunting to start that straight away. Some people do advocate starting that straight away, but you don't have to, it's just personal preference. Over the coming weeks and months there'll be more videos like this posted on this channel to help you learn Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, as well as various other languages. If you'd like to look at some other free resources on the website, there's a resources section and that gets added to weekly. There's general advice on language learning and there's a tab specifically for Portuguese resources, focusing particularly on films you can watch to help improve your Portuguese, and each of these has links to relevant videos and articles that will add context to the film you've watched, and adding this context helps you to remember the phrases you've come across, and it just makes the whole process more enjoyable. If you'd like more detail on how to learn Portuguese, whether that's Brazilian Portuguese or European Portuguese, there's a How to Learn Languages guide, How to Learn Portuguese. Most of the resources in the book are centred on Brazilian Portuguese, but there are resources in there for European Portuguese as well. The guide goes into lots more detail and it's a way for you to have everything you need in one place, with links to useful resources and a plan laid out for you. There's also a detailed section on the history of the Portuguese language. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you found it helpful, and see you next time.